Hey everybody, I just saw Star Wars The Last Jedi 2 days ago. I wanted to get this video out quickly, but I wanted to take some time, first of all, to organize my thoughts about it, to kind of process what I had seen and draw some of my own conclusions. I took some time to do some research on Twitter and YouTube. I watched some other people's reviews. I kind of got a sense of how people were feeling about this movie, and so now I think I'm adequately prepared to address some of my own thoughts on it. And the points that I'm going to make, or at least the core of my argument, I don't think anyone else has made yet, and I feel confident about saying that. So hopefully this video will be useful, and without further ado, let's get right into it. My main point that I want to talk about is the classical unities. These are 3 points laid down by Aristotle in his Poetics, and they formed the basis for literary convention and literary criticism for a long, long time. The first one is time, the second is place, and the third is action. Time refers to how long the story goes for, essentially, and the time frame in which the story takes place. Aristotle said that this was ideally 1 day. However, of course, these rules can be bent and broken. If you understand the convention thoroughly, you want to know what you're doing before you break any of the conventions, but doing so can make a good, fulfilling story. This is true of really any medium, not just books or films, but video games as well. The second is place. Essentially, you want to keep your story all within one geographic environment. You don't want to have people going all over the world, and if you do, you want to kind of keep everybody together in one location at the same time. This leads into the third one, action, which is essentially subplots, character development, and the relationships between characters. You don't want to have too many subplots happening. You want to not have too many characters in your story, and you want to have all of those characters' motivations and subplots all involved in the overall story. You want them to be integrated into one unit or one whole, hence why they're called the Unities. And these 3 points all help to keep your story kind of focused on a central idea or theme, or a couple of themes or ideas, so that you can keep your whole story focused, and so that people don't get bored, or people don't get confused when they watch your movie, or they read your book, or whatever. So in order to better understand how The Last Jedi fits into the overall canon of the Star Wars universe, let's talk about the other Star Wars movies and how all of them either adhered to or did not adhere to the classical unities, and how that turned out for those movies. So the first movie was Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, originally just titled Star Wars. Basically, everybody's together for the whole movie, besides that first act where Leia and Vader are confronting each other on the ship at the beginning. Basically, that's just a prelude to the rest of the movie. It's like a prologue. As far as I'm concerned, the real meat of the story begins when Luke meets up with C-3PO and R2-D2. After that, everybody's together. They're gathering the group. They meet Ben Kenobi, still in the same group. As one unit, they go into Mos Eisley and they meet Han Solo and Chewbacca. They leave for the Death Star. They rescue the princess. The characters split up while they're on the Death Star, but basically everything that all the characters are doing, including R2 and 3PO offering support via the radio and turning off the trash compactor, and Ben Kenobi turning off the tractor beam, all facilitates the character's escape with the princess. And also the characters develop further by Ben Kenobi being killed. Specifically, Luke develops further, and it's all one tightly built package. And then after you get to Yavin 4, the characters go and attack the Death Star. Everyone is involved in that attack. Even the characters who are not doing anything per se, they're on Yavin 4, that's the stakes. If Luke fails to blow up the Death Star, those characters are going to die, including Princess Leia and the rest of the rebels and 3PO. Han is attacking the Death Star directly along with Luke by the end. Even Ben Kenobi, who's dead by this point, is whispering in Luke's ear to use the Force as a ghost. And this is both developing Luke's character further and also giving him that added push that he needs to destroy the Death Star. So, by the end of this movie, essentially, one thing is happening. Empire Strikes Back, the characters split up shortly after the beginning of the movie. Han Solo and Princess Leia are being chased through the asteroid field by the Imperials, which, by the way, is basically the main plot of The Last Jedi. They kind of copied Empire Strikes Back for a lot of things and a little bit of Episode 6, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And Luke is off doing his own thing, training on Dagobah, so there's essentially two different stories happening here. Even when we get to Cloud City, Han and Leia are still being chased around by stormtroopers, and Han is getting frozen in carbonite while Luke is off doing his own thing, fighting Vader. Now this works because the main theme of this story is supposed to be isolation, and it's supposed to be about Luke trying to get back to his friends, and two plot lines isn't really that many. This is one of those instances in which breaking from convention works in the long run, but you really have to be careful, as we'll see in a moment. So, Return of the Jedi comes out, that's Episode 6, and in this movie, by the end, you have Luke on the Death Star confronting Vader and the Emperor, you have rebels on Endor who are trying to destroy the shield generator, and you have Lando and the rebels in space trying to destroy the Death Star. So there's three things happening here in this movie, and they're interconnected, but the scene where Luke is confronting Vader and the Emperor is really more of him viewing or observing the rest of the action. He's not really involved in the action, he's just observing the action at a distance. But the action itself that's happening outside of him, the action on Endor and in space, is causing Luke to have some stakes there, which helps facilitate his temptation to the dark side. His friends are in danger, and that's what makes it possible in this case for the Emperor to tempt him. Now, I think that most people who watch Return of the Jedi think that this scene in which Luke is confronting the Emperor and Vader is the most interesting scene, partly because it's the most tied up in the rest of the franchise. It's the main story that's happening here, and that goes back to the Unities. It's one story that you want to tell. Nobody really cares about the destruction of the second Death Star because we've already seen that once before, and also because that's not really the main plot. And then we get into Episode 1, which came out in 1999. It was the next movie that was released. And this is the one that I think is most analogous to The Last Jedi. Aside from all the direct references and the same structure from Empire Strikes Back and those scenes that were taken from Return of the Jedi, like when Kylo Ren confronts Snoke, this movie is most analogous, essentially, to Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. So, by the end of Episode 1, there are 4 different things happening. There's the Gungans fighting the droid army on Naboo, Padme with the royal security guards or whatever are storming the palace to capture Newt Gunray, who we don't really care about, by the way. And then there's a lightsaber fight with Darth Maul and 2 Jedi, and there's a space battle in which Anakin is involved, and he's trying to destroy this droid control ship. The point is that there are 4 things happening here, and that's way too many subplots to be handling at one time. Plus, there's way too many characters involved, and that's really where the heart of this problem shines through. The Phantom Menace doesn't have a main character per se. It has Anakin, but is he the main character? Not really, because he doesn't even show up until halfway through the movie. Is it Qui-Gon? Not really. I mean, he's more of the wise, elderly Jedi Master. We have Obi-Wan, but he's on the ship the entire time that they're on Tatooine. Is it, the Emperor? No, he's the bad guy. He's the antagonist. Is it Padme? No. Like, she doesn't even show up really fully in her form as the Queen until the end. She's on Tatooine, but she doesn't even have speaking roles for, the whole first act. So it can't really be any of those characters, and the characterization is obviously bad too, but aside from just those other mechanical problems with the movie, and those other conventional problems, there's too many characters, there's too many subplots, the story doesn't follow the classical unities.
It's a little disjointed.
Seems like a lot of short scenes.
It's bold in terms of jerking people around, but I may have gone too far in a few places.
Now, after the backlash for Episode 1, George Lucas kind of got his act together and figured out that there was too much happening, and he focused on Episode 2 on just a couple characters. He has basically Padme, Anakin, and Obi-Wan. Those are the main characters. They go their own separate ways in two different places, and it's kind of disjointed, but it's basically all the same thing as Empire Strikes Back. It's two different groups. It's not too much. He doesn't depart too much from the classical Unities in that movie. Now, there are other problems with that movie, obviously, but Revenge of the Sith kind of brings it back as well. There's only like two things ever happening at once, and it's all kind of one focused narrative. Now, we get to Episode 7, The Force Awakens, and that movie is, for better or worse, basically a carbon copy of Episode 4, A New Hope. And that movie was enjoyable, but it's enjoyable in the same way that watching Episode 4 again is enjoyable. It's basically the same story. There were some things taken out of Empire that were thrown into this movie, and it was fun, but there weren't a lot of things going on that were new, and there were a few things that were wrong with it in general. But this review is about The Last Jedi, so let's get into that. We go from one subplot happening, essentially, at the end of The Force Awakens. Kylo Ren is fighting Rey and Finn with a lightsaber, and Poe shortly, briefly cuts away to him destroying Starkiller Base in his X-Wing. But that's all we get from that. It's all kind of one united experience. They're all on Starkiller Base. All the stuff that they're doing is basically related to Episode 8, which is like, not even by the end, like by halfway through the movie. And I remember getting bored leading up to this point. I remember having a sense of disappointment walking out of the theater, and I remember feeling bored like an hour or so into the movie. And this movie is 2 hours and 40 minutes long. This is like Lord of the Rings length almost. This is way longer than a lot of the other Star Wars movies. I think it's the longest one, actually. And you can see on YouTube there's interviews with Rian Johnson, the director and writer, talking about how he wanted a 3-hour cut. Like, wow, man. I mean, you really got to fill that with content if you're going to make a movie that's that long. But this movie was 2 hours and 40 minutes. I remember getting bored, like a little bit past an hour. And it was about the same time that Finn and Rose were leaving to go to the casino planet, which is a completely unnecessary side plot. Any other review that you go watch on YouTube, I can almost guarantee is going to talk about how that was a problem. Even positive reviews are going to talk about how that was a problem. The casino planet meant nothing, right? So everyone else has talked about it. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but essentially, the Unities were not adhered to in this movie. There's multiple different main characters, or people who could be perceived as the main characters. I thought Kylo Ren was the main character by the end of the movie, to be honest, and I was rooting for him. And when you're rooting for the guy who's the head of an evil empire, who's like blowing up a rebel base and like trying to kill a bunch of people, maybe your film has a bit of a problem, I think, maybe. So, like, Kylo Ren is a protagonist. He's presented that way anyway. The real antagonist seems to be Snoke, because Hux is just kind of a loser in this movie, which is contributed to by the fact that Poe Dameron, who's another protagonist, by the way, just, like, insults his mom at the beginning. I mean, is this Xbox Live? Like, or is this Star Wars? Like, I get that you can have some jokes in there, but the tone is a little bit, it's dispersed a little bit, so it didn't feel like I was getting tonal whiplash or anything from watching this movie, but it was a little bit weird to see jokes like that in my Star Wars movie, you know? But Poe Dameron's the main character. He has that whole mutiny situation going on the main ship, and the whole plot with, obviously, like, other people who talked about this, so I'm not going to get too far into it, but the ships chasing each other at different speeds or whatever, like, that was contrived and it didn't make sense. Just like how in Episode 1, a lot of the motivations of the Trade Federation didn't make sense and felt overly contrived for no particular reason. That made it more difficult to empathize with the characters. That made the villains seem kind of mysterious, which I guess is the point, but it doesn't make any sense. If they're mysterious because their motivations obviously don't make sense and those motivations are never explained in other movies, like, well, they were just stupid? I mean, how did they run a trade federation? Anyway, enough has been said about how Episode 1 is bad, but this movie is basically just a rehash of Episode 1. Like, the characters' motivations don't make a lot of sense in many cases, which leads into another character who's portrayed as a protagonist with a lot of development. That's Luke Skywalker. And he he does something so out of character
It was
in this
shocking
movie.
to me to read what Ryan had written.
I went to Ryan's office and I was like, we need to have a talk about what's happening here.
When I read 8, I told Ryan, I fundamentally disagree with virtually everything you've decided about my character.
He tries to kill Kylo Ren before he's Kylo Ren, when he's just Luke's apprentice. Luke tries to kill him with a lightsaber in his sleep. And that isn't really something that Luke Skywalker would do. I understand that it was just like a momentary thing for him where he thought about it and then it was a misunderstanding kind of, but that's not really something that Luke would do. Like, look at how heroic he is in episode 6, particularly at the end. He resists the temptation of the Emperor. He says, no, I'm a Jedi, like my father before me. I'm a good guy. Like, he's the whole archetypal structure of those movies is about him regaining the tradition of his father in order to basically revivify his father. There's a lot going on with that I'll explain in a little bit, but this doesn't make sense for Luke's character to go and kill children. Like, that's an Anakin Skywalker thing. I mean, talk about killing younglings. Like, wow, man. I don't think this really fits with him. I'm not going to get too much into that because I think it's been covered a lot already, but wow, like, that doesn't make sense, dude. And then we have Rey, who's another main character, and we have Finn and Rose, who are both main characters, and Leia's not really a main character. She is kind of in the background on this one, but there's like 5 or 6 main characters: Poe Dameron, Kylo Ren, Luke Skywalker, Rey, Finn, Rose. Have I mentioned those already? I can't even tell if I'm double counting them. There's too many people in this movie that I should care about, or that I'm supposed to care about. I don't really like Rose at all, probably because she's associated with the casino planet, which I think is an entirely vapid and hollow part of the experience, and was kind of a waste of my time. I mean, I started to like Finn a lot in this one. Rey was just kind of there. It's a lot of these characters are kind of hard to identify with, but I think that it's set up that way, where different characters are going to be more readily identified with by different people. And that causes a bit of an issue, because in episode 1, everybody, like, there were 4 different characters, 4 or 5 different main characters, but they were all basically good. In this movie, Kylo Ren is a main character. He's portrayed as a protagonist, and I think archetypally he's the main character. Now, let me explain that in just a minute before I go further with this point, because I think this is really important, and I think this is a really core part of what makes Star Wars, and what makes this movie not fit in with the rest of the canon of Star Wars. So, initially when I saw this movie, I thought that the archetypal significance wasn't really there. Now, after thinking about it a little bit more, I realized that it's there, but it doesn't really point to the things that it should, and it doesn't really make sense within that greater archetypal structure. So let me explain. The main archetypal imagery used in this movie is of the tree, the fire, and the lightning. And this is all basically stuff that we've seen before in Star Wars used as archetypal imagery. In episode 5, we saw Luke going underneath the tree on Dagobah to confront this image of Vader that turned out to be himself in the end, and it was foreshadowing this revelation that Vader was in fact his father. In episode 8, we have that same imagery with, of course, the tree that houses the Jedi sacred texts, but also there's that scene where Rey goes down beneath the island, and she's called in her dreams or in these visions to this dark side nexus underneath the island, where the top half of the island is the light side and the bottom half is the dark side underground in these caverns. It's like this balance, right? And that makes sense because Star Wars has always been philosophically Buddhist, essentially, in its leanings. And this worked in the original trilogy mainly because the archetypal significance was there and because the archetypes being used were universal. Now, when Rey goes down underneath the island and she looks in this mirror thing and she confronts this entity, if it's the dark side or whatever it is, and she asks it who her parents are, and she doesn't get an answer, and she says, "I'm disappointed." And it's like, yeah, we're disappointed too as the audience. Like, there was no payoff there. There's nothing for me to care about with that. Now, archetypally speaking, there's a lot more that goes into this, but essentially, we're not getting the payoff that we were promised. There's something that's supposed to be there, and there's nothing there. This is the same thing as when Kylo Ren later on, as is foreshadowed by this scene, just like in Episode 5, how Luke going underneath the tree has a vision and has this dark side vision of himself in Vader's armor. That's foreshadowing how he's going to have this revelation about his parents. Luke's revelation meant something because he had parents who meant something. In this movie, Rey's parents are nobody from nowhere, as Kylo Ren says, and that just makes it seem vapid and empty. So now let me get into the tree more specifically. A tree represents, archetypally and in mythology, the center of your world. This is Yggdrasil, the world tree in Norse mythology. This is the trees in the center of the Garden of Eden in Christianity. This is the center of your world, and it creates the boundaries around your world. The same thing is represented by fire. Back when people were living in caves, they would have lightning strikes that would come down and create fires. People would keep those fires and harness them, and they would shield them from the wind and the rain, and this fire would form the center of their village. They would have to put more kindling on it perpetually, and it would be in the center of their settlement. It would be the center of their community, and they would keep it going perpetually for as long as they could. And that's how fire sort of came to represent society and culture and tradition in the same way that like a tree does. Fire is, of course, also represented by Prometheus, bringing the fire of technology or wisdom or the gods down to humanity. Fire is often portrayed as sort of the creative faculty, the secret fire of creation, of the faculty of creation that humans are given by God or by the gods, so that they can build up their society, so that they can create new things. And fire, just like water, archetypally is both a force of creation and destruction. So it's fitting here that Luke says, I'm going to burn down this tree, I'm going to destroy the sacred texts that lie at the heart of that tree, I'm going to destroy the Jedi, it's time for the Jedi to end, I'm going to burn this tree down, right? So that makes sense, that's mythologically and archetypally coherent. And then Yoda shows up as a Force ghost, and by the way, his puppet at first didn't really look... It looked wrong. There was something that looked off about it. There's some Uncanny Valley stuff going on. It wasn't how I remembered it looking in the original trilogy. Maybe that's just me. Maybe it was just the glow effect around him as a Force ghost. I'm not sure. But there are a couple of things that rubbed me the wrong way about this. So first of all, Yoda says that, have you read these ancient texts? Page turners, they were not. Like, these are boring old books. What you really need was in your heart the whole time. And that's kind of a cheap line. That's not something that is classically acceptable, that you have the strength within you and that you don't need any external knowledge or wisdom to achieve your goals or to become fulfilled as a person or to achieve your potential in whatever form that might take. I mean, classical philosophy, even Eastern philosophy, which is what Star Wars is primarily based upon, isn't really like that. I mean, even if you go back to the sacred Hindu texts, if you look at the Upanishads and things of that nature, they place a very heavy emphasis on the reading of ancient texts and on the passing on of wisdom and the cumulative knowledge of their people. That's essentially what tradition is the compiled legends and stories and ideas of a people. And so for Luke to just say, we're going to destroy this, and for Yoda to also say that, well, yeah, these books are just boring, they're not useful, we're going to destroy them, but not because they're not useful so much as because they're boring. Like, maybe that's just kind of a joking line on the part of Yoda, and he's kind of played in the original trilogy and in this movie as sort of a senile old guy, but that did kind of rub me the wrong way. Now, the second thing here that I need to mention is the lightning. Now, lightning traditionally is associated with God or the father or the king or the leader, right? The patriarchal leader generally of a people. This is like Zeus hurling lightning bolts. This is God smiting people with lightning bolts. This is Thor hurling lightning bolts, This is all associated with that kind of an archetype. And before the prequels started giving everybody lightning powers, Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, has the Emperor shooting lightning out of his fingertips at Luke. And this is tied into the overall archetype of Star Wars as a whole. So there's an archetypal story that manifests different ways in different generations, in different stories, in different cultures, but the closest version I can get, or that I have seen, to the original version is the ancient Egyptian myth of Horus and Osiris. So essentially, Osiris is the king of Egypt. He has a son named Horus. Set, the evil brother of Osiris, comes out of the desert to kill his brother. He tears him apart. Specifically, he rips off his arms and legs. And that kills him, and Osiris goes into the underworld, where he is dead, right? Horus is represented by a falcon. He has good eyes, good vision. This represents the vision of the youth. And Osiris represents the culture and the traditions of that society. And the culture is dead, right? Because culture is just books and ancient texts, essentially. It's just ideas. And ideas are dead things. They're not alive. They need people to breathe new life into them and to bring them forward into the new generation, to temper them with vision, essentially. So the story goes that Horus goes down into the underworld and he gives up one of his eyes, representing his vision, to his father Osiris, and that revives Osiris, and they return to the surface world together and they defeat the usurper Set. So in Star Wars, this is essentially the Emperor turning Vader to the dark side. The dark side is like Vader going into the underworld. Luke is like the son going down into the underworld to revive his father. He's tempted by the Emperor. He has a brief flirtation with the dark side, and then he eventually turns his father, and his father kills the Emperor with Luke's help by Luke reviving him. And then they would rule together, but Vader dies at the end, right? Now, this is reflected archetypally, of course, in Episode 5, when Vader reveals that he is Luke's father, and he says, "Join me and together we can rule the galaxy as father and son." Now, this is where the postmodernism comes into it, the postmodern deconstruction, which is essentially a philosophy, without getting too much into all the details of it, that advocates for the destruction of traditions and the subversion of these archetypes. So there's two different ways to subvert archetypes. There's the way that The Last Jedi does it, and there's the way that The Empire Strikes Back does it. And the way that The Empire Strikes Back does it, and the original trilogy in general does it, is essentially more tragic in many respects, more classically tragic than it is actually postmodern, and that's what makes for a good story. It subverts a few things by inverting the settings and the imagery that's used. For example, instead of going into the underworld or hell, Luke goes into the heavens or Cloud City to confront his father. There's all kinds of different things like that. Instead of giving up his eye, of course, Luke gives up his hand. You could say something about how that's more influenced by the modern emphasis on doing things rather than seeing things, or on structuralism versus functionalism. But without getting too deeply into that, you don't really need to understand all that to understand the metaphor and the analog that this has to the archetype. Luke loses his hand. He gives up his hand so that his father can live, but his father doesn't live. He realizes that his father was right, and Luke is offered to join his father to overthrow the usurper, the Emperor. And this is, in this case, portraying the Empire as the good guys, but obviously we know that they're not the good guys. And so then Luke falls down this big shaft and thinks that he's going to die. He chooses death, which is essentially the ultimate act of evil, act of defiance, is like suicide, right? Destruction of life, but also like the destruction of one's own life. So he falls down this shaft and Leia picks him up and he survives, whatever. In the new movie, in The Force Awakens specifically, this same archetype is illustrated when Kylo Ren kills Han Solo, his father. But in this case, the tradition that's being overturned or subverted is not the tradition of the Empire, it's the tradition of the Rebellion. And in some respects, The Last Jedi seems to be a continuation of that, and maybe it's always been there that this is the logical conclusion of such a story, but I don't know if that's really the case necessarily. And maybe some of the mechanical elements get in the way, maybe some of the less archetypal elements get in the way. For example, like obviously the classical unities being the main core of my argument here, you know I'm going to come back to this. The classical unities are the main problem here, and that's manifested both at the archetypal level and at just the mechanical level of how the movie is made. Obviously the movie is shot very well, there's some really cool shots, there's some really good sound design, but the point is that the story, the mechanics of how the story is told, the tone and the pacing and so forth, are all reflective of the problems at the archetypal level and of the problems with the classical unities. The classical unities essentially meaning the whole experience being brought together as one unit, and at two different levels, essentially, the story is not operating properly. Which brings me back to the point that I was making earlier, which is that there's too many protagonists in this story. There are too many heroes, right? Episode 3 in its title crawl said infamously that the galaxy is at war and that there are heroes on both sides. And everyone was like, okay, that's a funny joke, right? There's villains and there's heroes in this movie. There's not actually heroes on both sides, but that was really just paying lip service to this idea that there's no real good or evil, and that both sides are just part of a balance, or not just part of a balance, but that both sides are genuine protagonists, right? And in this movie, that idea is made manifest by making all the characters protagonists, essentially, right? As I said, there's like 5, 6 different protagonists in this movie. There's too many characters to care about. But besides that, where episode 1 had a whole bunch of characters that you're supposed to care about and identify with as the protagonist at different points in the movie, this movie has villains that are protagonists. As I said, right, Kylo Ren is a protagonist in terms of how he's portrayed. And what's more startling, and what I think is more of a problem in this movie, is that Kylo Ren has motivations that more closely align with the archetypal structure of the story being told than any other character in this movie. Now, I'm somebody who is more in tune with this, I think, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about it and studying it, so of course it's going to color my vision of a movie when I sit down and watch it. And I'm going to explain, first of all, why I think that Kylo Ren is basically the hero of this story, even while admitting that I think that other people are probably going to have other ideas about who was the main character, and why that's a problem that we basically have different ideas about that. So, Kylo Ren wants to destroy the past.
Let the past die. Kill it.
That's what Yoda wants to do, that's what Luke wants to do. They say, let the Jedi end, they're going to burn down the tree. Yoda strikes the tree with lightning, basically saying that you have the approval of God, essentially, to destroy this tradition, that we are going to strike it with lightning, we are going to light a new fire. And that's the other thing about fire, is that it represents existentialism and nihilism more than it represents the more traditional belief in objective meaning or in God, right? Because existentialism and nihilism represent a belief in subjective meaning or in no meaning, right? Essentially, no objective meaning. Now, if you're going to have a situation like that, you need to be constantly feeding the fire. You need to be putting more kindling on the fire so that you can keep society going, right? There's this idea that culture is going to die, that you don't have an infinite culture like a church or a religion that's going to keep going forever, that you can always adhere to universally and for all time. There's this idea that it's just going to go out eventually just by the normal wear and tear of time. That, you know, monkeys with typewriters, if you have an infinite amount of time, the monkeys with typewriters are going to write the complete works of Shakespeare, right? If you give it enough time, and eventually someone's not going to be tending the fire will go out. Society will collapse. And that's been borne out by the idea that societies do collapse, right? No society has ever lasted the full breadth of human history. China's gotten pretty close. They've been around for like 5,000 years, but certainly not in the same form. And human history has gone on arguably for more than 5,000 years. The point is, though, that this represents two different views, archetypally speaking. And I think that that's why certain people who have a more traditional view of meaning and of metaphysics are going to side more with Kylo Ren, whereas people who have other perspectives are more likely to side with other characters. And people without a very developed sense of any of these things are probably going to side with not Kylo Ren because he's the bad guy in terms of how it's portrayed. The Empire is bad, the Rebels are good, right? That's classic Star Wars. But in this movie, for me, it felt like Kylo Ren was the hero, and by the end of the movie, I was rooting for him. I wanted Rey to join him when he says, "Join me, and together we can destroy the past." And it's like, archetypally, he's the good guy, but that's not who everyone is going to perceive as the good guy, right? And obviously he does some bad things, like in Force Awakens we see him slaughtering an entire village for no reason, basically, at the very beginning. But that goes back to the love of something that's good, even though it's not that entity or that force or that group always does purely good things. So there's this idea in philosophy called the transcendentals, which is goodness, beauty, and truth. And classical and scholastic philosophy holds to the idea that every object or entity which exists has these three attributes, that it is good, true, and beautiful. And that's why, for instance, it's okay to be patriotic. It's in fact a moral good to be patriotic, or it's an ontologically good entity that your country is. When you say, hey, I love America. It's like America hasn't always done good things. America's done plenty of bad things in the past, right? But it's still a good country, and it's worthy of your love and your patriotism, or whatever country you live in, despite the fact that it has done bad things. That's why it's not okay in basically any religion and any consistent philosophy to hate people or to not treat other people with love and respect and compassion, because other people are good. They're goods in and of themselves. That's why it's not okay to say, morally speaking, that the ends justify the means, right? That's why moral relativism is unacceptable. So when we look at Star Wars, the First Order, in this case, looks pretty appealing, at least to someone with a more classical view of philosophy and ethics and metaphysics and epistemology as I do. That's what the First Order represents. And it's not just in that, but it's also the traditional way that they dress. Specifically, Kylo Ren and the Knights of Ren, if that's what the guys in the red uniforms in Snoke's entourage were, those guards, they look like knights. They look like classical knights carrying, Kylo Ren carries a sword. It's got the crossbar at the hilt, so it looks like a sword. Swords are really important archetypal images, especially a sword that looks like a cross because it has the crossbar, not just in Christianity, but because the cross is an important symbol, archetypally speaking, for the crossing, even in existentialism, and especially in existentialism, for example, of the intersection between the known and the unknown, which is essentially, it's an essential part of the hero's journey. There's so much about the First Order that is archetypally appealing. Now, I know that not everyone is going to agree with me on that, and that's fine, and that's understandable, and that's the simple and very specific reason why this movie is kind of a mess, right? So going back to the Unities, if it's not one integrated experience, people are going to get lost, people are going to get confused, no matter how smart they are. It's hard to care about all the characters, right? I mean, even if you're smart enough to follow a story, like, if you go and watch Inception, that movie is one story. It's super convoluted and complex, but you can enjoy that story if you're smart enough, right? Or if you're just, if you care to watch all the details, because, I mean, that's a ridiculous movie. The point is, it all has to be cohesive, and this movie isn't cohesive. There's too many characters, there's too many places, and the time is kind of fine, but I mean, the runtime of the movie is 2 hours and 40 minutes. If you're going to do that, that's okay, but you have to have the other two supporting factors. That's the problem here, is that the place and the action don't hold up to scrutiny. There are too many things happening here. There are too many characters that we're told we're supposed to care about, and that's the real problem with this movie. Now, in effect, what that's going to do, and what that has done, is that everyone's going to identify with different characters, and because some of those protagonists are villains, i.e. Kylo Ren, some people are going to disagree about who the good guys are in this movie. And you can only have one character or one side win in the end. You can't have the First Order win, and that's the end of Episode 9, because ostensibly there's not going to be an Episode 10. I mean, Disney might do it because they want money, but if we end Episode 9 and the First Order wins and Kylo Ren takes over the galaxy, most people are not going to be pleased about that. But if he doesn't, or if he converts to the light side, or if he does anything other than what he's doing, essentially, then that's going to upset a whole other demographic of people. So what they've done, what Rian Johnson has done, the director and writer, has apparently been to divide the fan base between two different groups. But besides that, it's subdivided further. If you go on Twitter and you look up what people think, it's clear that people have different favorite characters. And obviously in the original trilogy, you can talk about how that's the case. Different people like Han Solo, different people like Luke, different people like Leia, right? But this situation in The Last Jedi is qualitatively different. And I think this real difference lies in the fact that villains are considered heroes in this movie and vice versa, depending on who you are. Now, there are ways that this story could be resolved in Episode 9 in a way that is maybe not satisfying for contemporary audiences, but that would at least satisfy the necessity for an archetypally acceptable resolution to this story. So, for example, the Iliad, at the end of it, there's no good or evil characters per se. It's really just a misunderstanding, kind of. The Trojans are fighting the Greeks are attacking Troy, and at the end, Achilles kills Hector, the champion of the Trojans, and drags his lifeless body around behind his chariot, if I remember correctly, around the city of Troy in full view of his wife and children. And it's a tragedy. That's what Shakespeare told a lot. He had tragedies. These are some of the greatest stories that we have. There are all kinds of writers like Aeschylus and so forth that have written good tragedies. But Star Wars isn't gonna fly as a tragedy. People won't like that. Now, obviously, Episode 3 had a pretty tragic ending, but people could still take their kids to see that. That wasn't something that was a deal breaker because it was at the end of the prequel trilogy. If this is at the end of the entire series as a whole, then that's going to be problematic. I mean, I don't think that Disney is going to make Episode 10 and then expect that people are going to go back and see that. Maybe they will. Maybe they want more money. But the point is that you can't make a tragedy for children in this day and age. I don't think that people are going to go for that. So I don't think that they can really get themselves out of this corner, and that's a bit of a problem. They've written themselves narratively into this corner where they can't do anything now, and Rian Johnson seemed like he just wanted to tear everything down, and I get that. That's kind of the postmodernist, deconstructionist attitude. But if this is its logical conclusion, then I don't know what there is that's left. Certainly not a good story, and I don't really know where they're going to go from here. So as far as this review goes, I guess that's it. I don't really know what to make of The Last Jedi, except to say that it's basically The Phantom Menace. It ruins the story of Star Wars by writing itself into a corner that it can't possibly perform in, and that there's no way out of. It confused a lot of the fans and divided the fan base further. And all of this on top of all the other mechanical issues with the movie, with the pacing in the middle, with all the other political messaging that was happening in this movie that was not really necessary, and which particularly in the casino scene felt forced, even though I basically agreed with the messages that they were sending out about the military-industrial complex and animal cruelty, but didn't feel like it was built up at all. It didn't feel like there was a point to it. It was just there. And I don't want to get too far into any of these additional issues because other people have already discussed them at length, but suffice it to say that this is not a very good movie. It's a decent movie in some ways, but it's not good enough to be a Star Wars movie. Just like the prequels were not really good enough to be Star Wars movies. This is kind of on par with those in many respects. I think that the story was a lot more consistently fun at some points, but honestly, I'd rather watch Revenge of the Sith than watch this movie again. I've been thinking earlier that The Phantom Menace is a better movie than this one, and I don't think that that's the case anymore. I initially thought that over the first day or so after seeing it, but now I'm sort of coming to my senses. I think that realistically, this movie's not that good, but it's not the worst movie I've ever seen. I mean, I don't know if I can really recommend that you see it, but that's up to you, really. At any rate, that's all I have to say, so thanks for watching. If you liked it, go ahead and leave a like, or don't, whatever, it's your life. And leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought about this if you have any critiques, because it's quite possible that I'm wrong. I don't know. But have a nice day, and we'll see you next time.